All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the AIPG Lunch and Earn webinar for October. I'm Aaron Johnson, Executive Director of AIPG, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to be with us today. A couple of very quick sort of bookkeeping notes. If you need continuing education credit for this webinar, the certificate will go to the email address to which you used when you signed up. There's no need to request one. That system is automated. If you need continuing education credit for your registration in the state of New York, you must complete a 5-question assessment at the end of the webinar. You need to get 4 of those 5 questions correct, but you can retake that assessment as many times as you like. We'll put the link to the assessment in the chat at the end of the webinar, and you'll have about an hour to get in and get that completed. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Jeff Bradley from Northwest Missouri State University. He will be our host this afternoon. Jeff did his undergraduate work at Northwest, went on to Oklahoma State University, where he became a cowboy, got a master's degree there, then went back to Northwest Missouri State to become faculty, where he became one of the first senior instructors to be recognized by the university. I've also been able for the last nearly 2 decades, as much as it pains me to admit that, to call Jeff both colleague and friend. We've spent many hours and covered many miles in the front seat of an old Dodge van, hauling students and camping equipment all over the American West. So, Jeff, a pleasure to have you today. The floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Aaron. And thank you to AIPG. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about a pretty interesting disaster, I think, that happened back in the 1960s. As Aaron said, I have degrees from Northwest Missouri State and Oklahoma State. Both my degrees are geography, so I'm a physical geographer, earth scientist, I guess would be another label maybe, but I am not really a geologist. As far as my degrees, I have a geology minor, and I picked up a lot of geology through field trips and other studies, and just kind of as I'm teaching. My classes basically include general earth science, conservation of natural resources. I teach a natural disasters class. I've done that, in fact, the whole time I've been at Northwest, and this is year 35 here at Northwest now. So time flies when you're having fun. But I really love to teach and try to get students enthused about earth science and the environment and things like disasters and understanding risk that's out there. Because some of these people that I get in my classes, some of the students that I see would be geography majors, geology. We have a program here at Northwest. It's in emergency disaster management. And so the natural disasters class is a requirement, in fact, for those folks. So they're coming in from all sorts of different areas, and they're going out there into all sorts of different careers. So I like them to be aware of what's going on, just kind of how the earth works, and then how humans kind of fit in there. So when we talk about natural disasters, there's some of these disasters are just purely natural disasters, a hurricane, an earthquake, those sorts of things. And then some of them are more engineering related. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, is a little bit more of an engineering disaster. But there's always a human element. We wouldn't use the word disaster if it wasn't for people and property being affected. Unfortunately, lives being lost. Then it's a disaster. A lot of times it's just kind of the earth doing what the earth does. And so what we're going to look at today is the 1963 Vaiont Dam disaster, and some lessons learned since that time. So this is a disaster that kind of comes in under the radar, I think, in a lot of ways. It's not something outside of what I talk about in my classes. You don't hear a lot about. It's a very remote area in northern Italy. And so what we're going to do here today, I want to just kind of set the stage a little bit, the geologic setting of the area around Vaiont Dam, in that valley there, the Vaiont River Valley. Talk a little bit about the construction, a little bit of a historical perspective, some of the decisions that were made, and decisions that were maybe poor decisions in the long run. We'll find out about the construction of that dam. And so we'll dig into that just a little bit. We'll talk about, of course, the actual details of the 1963 disaster itself, and then look at some of the causes and kind of pick apart what really happened there, because it's fairly complex geology that we're looking at. And again, I'm not a geologist, so I can only get so complex with it, but there was several moving parts. that triggered this catastrophic slide. Talk about some of the lessons learned, some things that we know now, and just this photo that's on the screen right now. This is a recent photo. There's a memorial there basically for the folks that were the many lives that were lost actually, but it's kind of been left there. Well, for one thing, it'd be a major undertaking to try to dismantle that dam. There's no reason to dismantle it now, as you'll see as we go through here. But it's also just kind of a good memorial and a sign of what not to do, where not to build a dam, really. Of course, then we'll have time for some questions at the end, and I will do my level best to answer your questions when we get done with this. So, a little bit on the geologic setting. So, this I'm going to move myself over here. This setting for this is in northern Italy. It's in the southern Alps, or also known as the Dolomite Mountains, like you can see on this map. Not too far north from the Adriatic Sea, just in far northeastern Italy, and so it's a pretty complex geology. There's a lot of interesting structures in there, a lot of uplift features, a lot of folding that went on. There's a number of synclines in this area of the Southern Alps. What you had here, if you look at the cross section of the valley itself, there with the Vaiont River, you had layers of limestone, a lot of very thick layers of limestone, interbedded clay layers as well. And they believe the clay layers are derived from volcanic activity in the area far back in the geologic past. I don't really have the age on that. I could look that up certainly, but those clay layers are volcanic in origin, they believe, though, and they're kind of interspersed among the clay layers. But those are kind of the key players we'll see in this disaster, the way it all laid out. But I do want to go back for a second here. So you had the beds of limestone in there, but they also were dipping pretty severely downslope. So the Vaiont Reservoir, Vaiont Lake, right in there, a little bitty notch right there at the center of this cross section. Zooming in, they're showing after the slide. Yeah, the lake is just gone right here in this part of the valley, at this cross section. But these beds are really dipping down slope. And the thing I tell my classes, I talk about this and other slides and flows and other mass movement events quite a bit in some of my classes. And anytime you see beds of rock that are dipping down slope like that, that is literally a slide, just like at a park or at a playground or something like this, where kids hop up on that inclined surface and then gravity does the rest. So anytime you see your beds of rock dipping down slope like that, you already have to wonder if that's maybe a little bit unstable. Then you throw in the clay layers, and that just makes it that much worse. A lot of deep gorges in this area. The Vaiont River Gorge is one of many in this area, and it's kind of a result of previous glaciation, especially in the upstream areas. But you get these deep eroded valleys, and then they were just further deepened by downcutting from stream erosion, especially after the glaciers had melted back. But this is you can see the actual gorge, the black arrow indicating it's kind of pointing out a little piece of the dam that you can see kind of around the corner a little bit there. This yellow line represents the basic form, the structure of the beds there. And it kind of has this chair. A lot of the articles I kind of looked into when I was preparing for this webinar, just to dig a little deeper into the information behind it. A lot of those referred to this chair structure that was on the south side of the lake, the south side of the valley there, and that's kind of what that line they're highlighting that. Show that in fact there was some belief that chair structure would actually create a little bit more stability, a little bit more of a flat surface there to halt the flow of any material that might come down that slope initially. That was the belief. I'm not sure quite why they believe that. I think a lot of it is they didn't believe you'd have the entire mountainside that would essentially just be in motion at once. But you have already a very, very rugged landscape, very steep slopes. You have those dipping beds. So you kind of see, here's another view. This is from the dam itself, looking to the west, down through the mouth of the canyon there. Longarone, we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but that's off in the distance there you can see. But yeah, a little bit of the river down here at the very bottom. You can see there's an access road, but just classic gorge, V-shaped, notch out there in the landscape, like you see in many mountainous areas. So a map showing the area here, you can see that it does highlight at least one obvious slide deposit that had been noted. This was something they didn't go back afterwards, kind of during a post-mortem going into this project, building the dam. They had evidence of ancient slides in this area, and one of them right there highlighted on the map. And there were some smaller ones. There were a couple of small ones right in here on the south side of the valley as well. So it wasn't like they didn't know that was a potential, but they were relatively small deposits. A lot of them that had been charted, had been mapped at the time that they were considering building the dam back in the 1950s. So when we look at that, look at the construction of the dam. It goes back to the 1920s and 30s, really, when they were first seeing signs of some development potential in this area of northern Italy, and the need for maybe some hydroelectric power, because it was fairly remote at the time. And so discussions had started happening. People wanted to maybe look into building a reservoir, whether it be at this location or somewhere in the area, to provide power for some of these small towns, mainly small towns, no really large cities at that time in this area. And even today, there's not a lot of cities, certainly right there around Vaiont River Valley. But that was kind of the driving force, though, is trying to look at maybe hydroelectric power potential. Nothing really happened, though. The funding wasn't coming through. There wasn't a lot of serious interest until really coming out of World War II. Now, really, during World War II, Mussolini actually approved the construction of the Vaiont Dam. But it wasn't until 1957, actually, that another a company, one of the main power companies, and I'm going to butcher my Italian is my Italian is pretty much non-existent, but it was Società Adriatica di Elettricità, SADE. We'll go with acronyms. That was the power company that one of the largest power companies actually for all of Italy, and they kind of stepped in finally in the 1950s, and along with funding as part of the Marshall Plan, this post-World War II plan where money was available to European countries to kind of help rebuild after the war. And so there was some of that money available as well. The SADE came in there as well to finish off the funding and take on this project. And so you can see the kind of typical dam structure. It's an arch dam, it's a double arch dam, actually. Really an engineering marvel. And you can see how they kind of put this together, much like any other large masonry dam. I know with Hoover Dam in the southwestern United States, which is not quite as tall as this, but it's still a very large masonry dam. And the same kind of thing. They don't do a single concrete pour. That's just not practical. The concrete would never cure. And so they have segments. It's essentially a series of giant blocks they're making with these various separate pours of concrete. But the arch structure, then we're looking upstream at this point. So on the downstream side here, you can see this concave shape allows the force against the dam when it's filled up to press and allow that structure to slightly flex into the abutment, into the sides of the valley wall there, to just increase the seal, I guess you could say, and make it even less likely for water to find some way around this structure. So that's pretty typical with any large masonry dam. You see that with Hoover Dam, and again all around the world to this day. So the funding came through. There was a lot of concerns, though, because almost immediately they started seeing, and when I say immediately, once the dam was completed, and immediately upon filling this thing up, way before it was completely full at its normal pool level, they already started to see some signs of slides. They had a relative, well, I'd say relatively, compared to what we're going to talk about here in a minute, a relatively small slide. This scar that you see over here on the right side, the south side of the lake, in November of 1962, they had a slide that was estimated volume about 700,000 to 1 million cubic meters of earth. So, as I said, in relative terms, that was a relatively small slide. Still a pretty good mass. It generated a wave on the lake about seven feet high. So it wasn't anything catastrophic, but it was noticeable and it got their attention. But they and they had some other movement as well. They felt like that they could get by with this. Here was an alarming sign. They had a massive fracture open up on the south wall of the valley, just immediately upslope from the dam, and for about a mile, a little over a mile up river, this huge scar is kind of like a giant M. This is just a little piece of it here, but they start seeing movement. The whole mountainside, a large portion of it was in motion. Um, and in spite of that, they really thought they could get by with allowing small amounts of material to come down more slowly. That was kind of the goal. They thought, okay, we'll lower the lake level, and that's kind of what they did. They would notice movement, and in fact, the first movement they noticed a smaller amount of material that was actually set in motion was in 1960, just within a year after the dam was constructed, and they lowered the lake level quite a bit, and then it stabilized. Now the lead engineer, his name was Carlos Semenza, and he was a lead engineer on the project, and unfortunately passed away just months after the dam was completed. He was during the construction of the dam, before they even started filling it up, he was very adamant about some geological concerns, like the motion that they were starting to see, the slide deposits, the ancient slide deposits. At one point, he got to where he was actually recommending they just shut the project down. And this was when the dam was already, a large amount of it was already built, and he was recommending completely draining the lake and just abandoning the project, because he thought there was just no way it was going to be stable once that thing filled up. It didn't, I don't know if there was arrogance, money, a lot had been invested already, saving face. There was some of that I read about as well, where they thought, we can't abandon this now. This is the pride. This was the largest double arch dam when it was constructed. It was the world's highest dam, tallest dam, is about 860 feet high. So it's a massive structure, over 100 feet taller than Hoover Dam, and so there was just too much opposition for that and to abandoning the project. So they forged ahead anyway. Not to mention they were at the foot of Mount Toc, which Mount Toc had been labeled by the locals, some of the villages in the area, as the Walking Mountain. So I don't know. To me, that seems like a giant red flag. If the locals are calling this mountain the Walking Mountain because of the motion, because of the slide risk and the slide history, and so we're looking at Mount Toc here in the photo off here on the right hand side, and you can still see very well. This is a fairly recent photo, the scar on the landscape, but it was almost like a giant M when you got back and looked at it. Huge area, but it was about a 1.2 miles wide, an enormous area of the whole mountain that was in motion at times. So again, as I said, during construction, they had several times when they thought that lowering the lake level would stabilize it, and in fact, it did. They actually had some success with that. So in 1962, they were seeing motion to the tune of about a half an inch per day, and so they had a rainy period, and they had brought the water level up and let the lake fill up more. When they noticed this motion, they went ahead and had a lowering by quite a bit, by about 150 meters, I believe, on that first one. And so they dropped the water level down quite a bit, and it stabilized. And the motion really slowed down, pretty much stopped there for a while. They slowly started bringing the water back in then and bringing the lake level up. They had another rainy period in July of 1963. And at that point, they were looking at just maybe about a quarter inch of movement per day on average for that period. Still enough that they wanted to lower the lake again. So they brought the water back down, stabilized it again. Latter half of the summer of 1963, they noticed during another rainy period, they had the water back up pretty high again. And the average motion then was 8 inches per day. So it was, in several orders of magnitude above what it had been. So it's noticeable movement and alarming. again, Carlos Amenza at this point had passed away. He was the only real voice that was really trying to, kind of set the alarm bells. Well, at this point too, by the time you get to summer of 1963, it's done. The project's done. There's managing the water levels at this point. So it's not a matter of whether you can abandon it or not, but I guess they still could have just emptied the lake. And yeah, no one was willing to do that at this point. So they had a number of warning signs all throughout the construction. I mean, they had the mapped slide deposits before they even started building. Then they had plenty of other signs throughout the construction phase that it was very unstable. Well, by the time we get to October 9th, 1963, this was the night of the massive slide. At 10:39 local time, the north slope just gave way. They had brought the water back down again because they had a rainy period just shortly before this date, and so there's quite a bit of water in the system out there, and in the groundwater system, and so that it was moving again. They brought the water level down. This time it didn't work, and this happened. It was late. People were in for the night. It was a nice night. The weather was beautiful. Moon was out. People were in local bars and pubs, and or maybe in their homes watching soccer or football. Excuse me. To them, it was football. And so it was just a beautiful night, and they heard rumblings in some of the local villages, and they thought they didn't know what it was at first because they knew the weather was fine. It wasn't thunder, and it just sounded different. What was made this worse, more than just the slide itself. The slide, of course, was the catalyst for all of this. It was the fact that you had a massive displacement of water. You had this large reservoir that's hundreds of feet deep. And so suddenly in 45 seconds, you had a section of land about 1.2 by 1 square mile, or 1.1 mile by 1 mile surface area, approximately 260 million cubic meters of rock and soil that just dumped into the reservoir in, as I said, under a minute. So about 45 seconds for it to finally come to rest. It filled up the reservoir to a height about 150 meters above the old water line. That's just the debris pile. So you had this enormous volume of water that was suddenly displaced. It was somewhere on the order of 70 million cubic meters of water that were just suddenly thrust up and out. And that was the big problem. Had the lake not been there, you'd have had a massive slide, but no one was really in the way. It would have caused problems with, it would have dammed up the river, and there would have been other secondary things, but there were no villages at the foot of the mountain. You would have had maybe no fatalities. Quite likely would have had no fatalities or injuries or anything. It would have been a mess trying to deal with this, how to divert the river around it, but it is a totally different disaster because the lake was there. And so this displacement of water had two prongs on it. You had, like the diagram here shows, and I apologize, the diagram's not quite as clear as I'd like, but you have the water pushed up, and the town of Caso, which sits about 250 meters above the lake level. And you can see by this blue line, this is showing the height of the floodwaters all around the lake and then downstream. But right here, Caso is right there. So that water was pushed up about 250 meters, roughly the height of the dam. So you have water pushed up that much further up out of the reservoir by 250 meters. The residents of Caso had talked about hearing this rumbling sound. They went outside. Of course, it's well after dark now, 10:39. Not quite sure what's going on. Oh, and I forgot to mention, too, there was also a massive air blast. That much material moving that fast, displacing not just the water, but there was a massive air blast. And so they feel this gush of air coming up out of the valley, followed by what seemed like just heavy rain out of nowhere, just sheets of water pouring on them. And very quickly, that rain was also involving parts of trees, chunks of rock, all kinds of things. I can just envision this biblical nightmare practically that was raining down on these people. It was pitch black. So there were fatalities there in Caso. even that high out of the water, 250 meters up. The water was then pushed, part of it was pushed up the lake, like the blue arrows show here. And so you did have flooding up here near the village of Erto, which luckily is a very small town, not a lot of people. It was lower in elevation, so it was down closer to the water. And so they did have a few fatalities there as well. I think altogether, there were around the lake, there were about 160 fatalities. So that's a bad enough disaster already, with the water sloshing back up the reservoir. The real problem, though, the by far the deadliest aspect was the water that was pushed up and over the dam. The dam held, um, which that seems kind of. I mean, that it was an engineering marvel, I guess. This dam, it only had a little bit of damage along the top of it, the top few feet. They had some pieces that were removed and plucked away by the water, but by and large, the dam is still there today, much like it was before this all happened. Um, but that water again was up around 250 meters above the lake level, sloshing over the dam, and then on the backside of this dam that's already, almost 250 meters high itself. And then you have water on top of that, another 250 meters. So I mean, this had a lot of velocity as that was careening down through the valley. It hit with such force that downstream from the dam, it eroded a hole in the valley floor that was about 40 meters deep and about 100 meters across. Just massive. I mean, it's like taking a bucket of water and just throwing it down at the ground into loose sand or something like that. Just carve out a hole, and that's what happened. I mean, because this water was airborne for a while, it hit and made a beeline right toward Longarone. So by far the worst impact was at Longarone. Actually, I'm going to go back here just for a second while I've got this map up here. Something we're going to talk more about that in just a second, but this water split like the diagram shows here, and you had flooding going downstream like you'd expect, but you also had water going upstream. That was such a massive surge of water. They estimate that by the time the water hit Longarone, it was about 70 meters deep still. So it was still a massive wave coming at them, loaded with boulders and debris carved out of the canyon here. But that water split and went upstream for almost a couple miles. And so I can just envision what it must have been like on this beautiful night. Again, beautiful weather, wasn't overly cold, just a chilly fall evening. And I can imagine there might have been some fishermen along the Piave River up there to the north of Longarone, just doing some late night fishing and hearing this rumbling, hearing this roaring, and out of nowhere, here comes this wave upstream at them, maybe 20, 30 meters high. Depending on where up the valley they were. But I can't even imagine something like that. It's just something, being caught off guard doesn't even describe it. But yeah, as I said, Longarone was the hardest hit. Longarone was just destroyed. Here's a before shot of Longarone, and Longarone wasn't right down in on the floodplain of the Piave River. It was up a little ways, so it had a little bit of elevation to it. But yeah, here's what it looked like before and afterwards. It was just largely washed away. Most of the town was washed away. 94% of the population died in that. So there were, I think, in Longarone alone, there were over 1,300 lives lost there. So it just a devastating flood. And here's some other shots from that. But you can see all the debris, too. There's just so much glacial debris washed out of that valley. All these large rocks. You had glacial debris along the valley walls. That's kind of contributing to the instability a little bit, they believe, and just added more material that could fall off in the lake. But then downstream from the dam, there's so much glacial debris in the outwash there from during the Ice Age, and that was all mobilized. And so you had just battering rams. It wasn't just clean water hitting these buildings. It was just an unbelievable torrent of rock and trees and water coming at them. They just didn't have a chance. And no warning. It was just on them in a couple of minutes. And they had no reason to believe that. In fact, they weren't really sure. The first thought was, for the survivors in that area, the first thought was the dam burst. I mean, that's the most obvious thing. You get this sudden torrent of water on you. Well, yeah, the Vaiont Dam must have burst. They woke up the next day and found the dam sitting there staring at them just like any other day. And so they're just totally blown away with what had happened. They figured out pretty quickly, of course, but they were not expecting to wake up and see the Vaiont dam there. But yeah, as I said, just unbelievable erosion and of the landscape, and just complete erasure of some of these small towns along the river there. Is yeah, just didn't have a chance. So what causes here? It comes back a lot to these dipping beds of limestone. So the limestone, some of those layers of limestone, at least, they had quite a bit of karst, especially up higher on Mount Talk, like this diagram shows. Um, they had karst features up there higher up, but even down here closer, the actual part that moved would be down here uh, closer to the river, the steeper slopes, and the steeper, as far as the angle, the dip angle there, much steeper as well. So you had those beds of limestone. You could get water down there very easily, and you had those clay seams that I mentioned earlier. Um, the clay layers were were really the culprit. I mean, when you combine that with these karstic um, beds of limestone, the other thing about the karst features, because you had some of that down slope as well, and so the belief is that that it's such a weathered limestone, at least several of the layers were very weathered, and so this allowed water to get into those layers even more effectively. A lot larger pores, you had caverns and typical karst features, and so you had water able to move in there much faster and help destabilize the toe of this slope, the base of the slope. Um, if it had been more of a solid limestone, that might not have happened quite as well. Quite honestly, some of the articles I read, some of the people, well, like Carlo Semenza, he really thought that, and others thought that this this slope and this Mount Talk and that whole area really was pretty unstable at best, even without the reservoir being there. The reservoir certainly was the catalyst in the presence of all that water, and that's obviously what caused the major problem with the flooding. But yeah, you already had a slight history there, even without a reservoir being built. So even at best, you have pretty unstable slopes out there. The clay seams um, did a couple of things. You had the weak layers of clay between these massive layers of limestone, so you already create a slip surface right there. And then you also had some problem with water being held below the clay layers. There was some belief with some that part of the reason for this is that you had the water getting in behind the clay layers. When they brought the lake level up, it would stabilize some of those layers. The pressure coming in from within the mountain, when they lowered it, and because of the heavy rain they had prior to October 9th, there's so much pressure coming in behind. When they lowered at that time, it set up such an imbalance in the pressure between where the reservoir had been and the internal pressure within Mount Talk. They just burst through, and that's probably what triggered it at that time, at least. But it was probably bound to go anyway, eventually. But yeah, the clay seams, it looked like it is the shear strength breaking down along those clay layers, and that's where most of the motion came from. And they underlaid much of that slope, and that's why all that material moved in mass. It wasn't small bits of it here and there. As I said, the glacial sediments probably contributed to this as well. You had more unstable material on the slopes to add to the material getting into the lake, the volume of material, as well as the damage done downstream by the presence of those outwash sediments and some of the till features that they had along the Piave River and downstream along the Vaiont River as well. The heavy rains definitely throughout the construction. We talked about how they lowered the lake and then they bring it back up. And I think they had done that one too many times, basically, and the pressure had built so much that it just didn't work out in October when they had that heavy rain and they initially lowered the lake level. Then they let it start coming back up again when they thought it was stabilized. I think it was already, the shear strength was already on the verge of breaking at that point between these layers. So really, the primary cause it really stems from those clay layers that existed between the layers of limestone and the shear strength finally giving way. And had those clay layers not been in there, you probably wouldn't have gotten maybe quite as much movement. You probably would have had a somewhat unstable slope just because of the angle of the slope, the dipping beds, the karst, but you probably wouldn't have just unleashed virtually an entire mountainside in one shot, and not moving with that velocity as well, had it not been for the clay. So that's kind of a breakdown of the main causes anyway. As I said, there were several things going on here, but bottom line is probably just was not the place to build a reservoir more than anything else. All right. So some of the lessons learned with this whole event, disaster, the warning signs were clearly not taken seriously. I mean, just picking this location at the beginning, I'm not quite sure. I never really read any articles that really dug into that. I wasn't able to find much information about why that location, in spite of all of these warning signs. Could they have not gone to maybe another valley just 2 miles away, possibly, and still had hydroelectric power potential? Because there were a number of these deep valleys in this area. So I'm not quite sure why they didn't pick a new location to begin with. But then once it started the construction phase, and they were still getting slides, they were getting motion there in the slope of Mount Talk, and they still were kind of forging ahead. They were kind of in too deep at that point, I think, and we were afraid of losing face. And some really truly believed that they could bring the mountain down slowly. They could actually vary the level of the lake and bring it down in small amounts. Now, I don't think they ever really thought that much material was going to move, because if had they thought that, I don't know what they were planning on doing with 260 million cubic meters of rock and soil. Even bringing it down in a controlled fashion is still going to fill in your reservoir eventually. So I'm not sure what they were thinking there, but just not enough in the way of geotechnical investigations leading up to this and trying to find the exact site for the dam. Shear strength along the clay layers was not really considered. They really didn't factor that in much to their calculations when they were trying to figure out where exactly to place the dam. They did have piezometers throughout to measure pore pressure throughout the valley, and they had a lot of that data coming in. They found out later, after the fact, and kind of went back and looked at what had happened and what data they had picked up and why they didn't react to things the right way, and all this post-mortem sort of thing. Some of the piezometers were too low. They were actually below some of the clay layers, and they were giving pressure readings of actually below where most of the water was. And so they were too deep with some of their piezometers. They were getting data that really wasn't showing them what the risks were up closer to the surface, near where those more unstable beds were. So they were looking at data coming in from some of those monitoring sites, and they thought, it looks pretty good. But they found out later, they're really just too deep in some cases. As I said, the scale, I don't think they really were expecting that kind of volume of rock. They saw that somewhat smaller slide that was maybe up close to 1 million cubic meters, which is still a large amount of rock, but still much smaller than what ended up happening in October. And I think that's what they were planning for. They're expecting that. They were expecting slower motion because, again, they weren't factoring in the clay layers and higher velocities, but they really weren't expecting that kind of a scale like what ended up happening. And so they just weren't prepared for that at all. And then when it came time to start notifying the public, when that very rapid movement was taken in the few days before the ultimate slope failure, when they had the movement on the order of 8 inches per day, like I mentioned earlier, they really didn't do a good job of warning the public. Now, the mayor of Erito, he did actually warn the people of his community, but some of the other communities they didn't, and just the rural residents, living outside of the towns in the valley and certainly downstream, they weren't expecting that kind of a displacement of water, because that smaller slide had displaced water to the tune of about 7 feet. Not a major risk, since the towns around the lake were well up off the water. Not a real threat there. And since they weren't expecting that kind of scale, that kind of huge volume, they didn't think you'd have something breaching the dam. In fact, there were some surveys that had been done with that scenario in mind, and they came to the conclusion that no, that you wouldn't have that kind of displacement. They thought it would stay in the lake. Any water displacement would not breach the dam. And yeah, it obviously, as we saw, completely failed. It more than breached the dam. So yeah, there were a number of things. Oh, one other thing about the notification of the public, there were actually lawsuits um, levied against some of the local newspapers when they saw some of that initial motion during the construction of the dam as it was filling up. Um, and they noticed motion, and some of the newspapers were putting that out there, just a legit story that hey, there's motion going on, and this is something we ought to be concerned about. The SADE, the power company, they sued some of the local newspapers because they were, in their mind, they were stirring up the public. They were spreading undue fears and concerns that really didn't need to be in the and so they actually go under court over some of these things to keep things quiet. So it's just a lot of bad decisions made during this whole thing. You had the natural processes already setting the stage for this, a long history of slides, a lot of instability already detected in that area. So, I mean, as I said earlier, it was an unstable landscape in terms of the mass movement potential, but they went ahead with the project anyway. And had that lake not been built, you wouldn't have had near this disaster. You would have had a massive, impressive slide, but you wouldn't have had anything like what we're talking about now. You wouldn't have had lives lost and that sort of thing. So the lake was definitely part of the trigger, saturating the toe of some of those limestone beds and destabilizing that, and then the added pressure from within the mountain from the heavy rains. Then the shear strength was just overcome. So it's just it's a cascading set of events basically that led to this. So hopefully that is some interesting knowledge that you weren't aware of already. It's a story that you hadn't heard before about Vaiont Dam, but there's a picture. The dam's there today. You can go see the dam. There's a memorial there and kind of a site where they have information about all this. And as I said earlier, this is just kind of left there as an example of what not to do. So at this point, I'll do my best to answer questions. I am going to be also sending my PowerPoint back to the folks at AIPG, and they're going to get that out and available to anybody that wants the set of slides. And I'll put my email address in there as well. And so feel free to, if I don't have an answer for you today, I'll do my best, but to absolutely email me, and I'll try to get an answer to you at a later time as well. So I'll take any questions at this point.
All right, Jeff, I see we've got a few questions popping into the chat. The first comes from Madeline Murphy. She asks if you could talk a little bit about the average thickness of those clay layers.
The clay layers ranged, from what I was reading, they were on the order of 5 to 15 centimeters, most of them. They were pretty substantial, but they weren't many feet thick by any means. They were relatively thin compared to the blocky limestone layers. Yeah, somewhere on the order of I think I read 150 millimeters for the thickest beds overall. So yeah, not a lot thick.
Mike Wolfert asks if there's a pool of water behind the dam today.
A small one. Yeah, well, actually, there has been. I don't know. Actually, today most of them may have drained out. They kind of have the water going around the dam. They've diverted through tunnels, so the Vaiont River flows on through. There was a small puddle, really. That's about it. Left behind. Most of that slide was up very close to the dam, and you can kind of even see in this photo here. Yeah, that you don't have to go too far on the other side of the dam, and there's the slide deposit. So yeah, just a very small puddle. The majority of the lake is a little over a mile upriver when you get to the true open water now.
I will note very quickly that Wendy has posted the link to the New York assessment quiz in the chat. So if you're looking for that, it is posted. We'll try to post it again just before we sign off. Michael J. asks if anyone has speculated about whether or not this slide might have happened if the dam hadn't been built.
Probably not to this scale. Most things that I was reading, they believe that this area was, of course, had already shown that it was prone to slides anyway, long before construction ever took place. But the volume, you probably wouldn't have destabilized that much material had the lake not been there. So you probably would have had smaller slides like that one that happened during construction, that to the tune of maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe a million cubic meters, but not hundreds of millions of cubic meters. So most people agree, from what I was reading, that yeah, it probably wouldn't have been on this scale had the lake not been there.
Just a comment on my end. One of the things this puts me in mind of, it's not a dam disaster, but it's similar in terms of having clay layers create glide planes. 1995 in Hot Springs, Arkansas, they had excavated the toe of a slope where the rocks were dipping toward the cut. So they basically created a high wall. It was the rocks there. If you're not familiar with that part of the country, there are a lot of cyclothems. So you have interlayered sandstones and clays. And then they had
Mhm.
an incredibly wet spring, and the slope failed because there was no support for the toe, and it crashed into the Springy Dingy novelty store and killed a couple of folks. So very similar in terms of the clays creating the glide plane. Tony Giunta is asking if you have any idea what the design power output of the dam would have been had it been able to be operational.
I don't have it. That I'd have to look that up for you, Tony. Yeah, I'm not sure on what the power potential would have been. I would imagine the potential would be very high because you have such massive head behind this dam. That water's falling hundreds of feet. But I'd have to look. I'd be just guessing at this point. So I didn't read in on that, but I can see if I can come up with an answer for you.
Question from Wayne. And Wayne, I'm not going to even attempt to butcher your last name. Wayne K. Asking if you saw any references to uh, whether or not the winds approached something like hurricane force in front of the wall of water as it rifled down the valley.
I didn't see specific velocities in it, but I did read some reports of some minor wind damage. So generally, with wind damage, you're talking up around 60 miles per hour minimum. Not quite hurricane force necessarily, but yeah, I'd say hurricane force 74 miles per hour. That probably I wouldn't be unheard of, because I did read some reports of some minor damage in places like Caso and some of the villages up the lake.
I do see a comment from Russ Patterson. Russ says in all caps, "Do not violate the dip slope," which truer words were never spoken.
Exactly.
You know, we've learned a lot since 1963, but we keep repeating some of those same problems.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
is sort of the last question and comment that I saw. Anyone else before we go have a question or a comment for Jeff? All right, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Jeff, thank you again
Okay.
for delivering our Lunch and Earn webinar for October. We will be back in November. I've been in contact with someone about presenting it for our November webinar. That will be the last Tuesday of the month. So keep your eyes peeled for the next AIPG Lunch and Earn webinar. Thank you,
Okay. Hey,
everyone,
Aaron,
for
I
coming.
saw someone raise their hand just now. Connie
Oh,
Cox just
someone,
raised her.
let's see. I am not seeing her. Let me see if I
I
can
saw.
find a way to
Huh.
make this a little bigger. Yeah, I'm not. I'm only seeing four
Okay. I
people.
saw something
Um,
pop up. Hand raised, but okay.
yeah, I'll look one more time here. And Connie, if you do have a question, one other thing you can do is we will be able to put you in direct connection with Jeff. We'll give you an email address if you want to chat with him. And Jeff has graciously agreed that if you do have further questions, we can just send those his way.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. We look forward to seeing you in November.
Okay.